¿Por qué cree que el capitalismo
Why do
tiene
you
tan
think
mala
capitalism has
prensa?
such a bad reputation and socialism has such a good reputation, even though capitalism has many greater achievements and socialism big failures?
Natural, en el
Ujú,
sentido, es algo que muchas veces contradice la naturaleza humana,
ujú.
contradice
Because
muchos
capitalism
valores
is
que llevamos
not
a pensar. El
natural,
capitalismo es algo
in
aprendido.
the sense that it is something that often contradicts human nature, that contradicts many of the values that we have. Capitalism is a learned thing. It is like science. It is something learned. It is not something that comes out of the human mind just like that. It requires forcing our brains into that way of reasoning. But disciplines such as writing and reading are also not particularly natural. They have to be learned with great effort over several years of our lives to be able to use them. And capitalism is also something that is not natural. The natural thing is to earn and spend. I don't know if it is the effect of evolution or culture, but the normal thing to do, if you earn money, is to spend it, right? The idea of saving money for the future, an uncertain future, in order to have something more in the future without knowing if you are going to have it, that requires discipline.
¿Por qué cree que se asocia el capitalismo con el consumismo? Porque yo creo
And
que
why do you
muchísima
think
gente
that
tilda
capitalism
el
is
capitalismo como
associated
un
with
muñeco de paja.
consumerism?
Porque el capitalismo genera tanta producción, que genera riqueza y
Because
genera muchos
capitalism
consumos.
generates so much production and wealth and generates many consumer goods. So many people can now afford goods that would have previously been considered luxury goods. Many pairs of shoes, branded clothes, certain trips. You couldn't do that before. It couldn't be done because they were too expensive or because there was insufficient production of these goods and so on. Now, capitalism has made goods like these much cheaper. I always distinguish between capitalism and the market, which are different things. They are related, but are not the same. Capitalism made these kinds of goods much cheaper. Travel is now available very cheaply. Relatively cheap clothes are available. We can have food of a certain quality relatively cheaply. We can enjoy certain luxury goods. The fact that you can watch this podcast, right? Watching it requires a form of technology that enables everyone to have the ability to watch any television show in the world on their mobile phone or computer, view any book in PDF or download it from there, or you can listen to any music. There are libraries now on any computer of millions of books, a library of millions of audios and all kinds of cultural information from all over the world, right? And that was achieved with capitalism. There are many people that are consumerists but are not capitalists. When you see an actor, a professional athlete, or an actress who spends money on luxury, people identify that with capitalism. These people are not capitalists. They are rich, but they are not capitalists. And there are people who are capitalists but not rich. Capitalism is a mentality, it is a technology, it is a habit of life that involves saving, living below what is produced, below what is earned, and systematically investing what is earned. That's basically it. And that requires, for example, mental technologies such as accounting. Werner Sombart, when he talks about capitalism, focuses on one word: accounting.
Pues yo creo que a día de hoy estamos muchas veces debatiendo un muñeco de paja sobre el capitalismo porque
Whenever
siempre que se
capitalism
habla
is
sobre el capitalismo
attacked,
yo creo que se
I think it
relaciona
relates
más
more
con
to
el tecnicismo.
Keynesianism and social democracy,
Claro, porque se ven los efectos del capitalismo,
Sí.
no el
because,
capitalismo.
of course, you can see the effects of capitalism instead of capitalism itself. Capitalism is extremely frugal. Capitalism is born of thrifty people, very austere. Weber's thesis, for example, says it has to do with religion, in the sense that some religions repress consumption. It is forbidden to spend lavishly, to indulge in luxury. So, what they earned was systematically reinvested. That is what is difficult to achieve. A person who saves and systematically dedicates those savings to obtain productive assets. Savings to build a factory, a bridge, a power plant. That is, saving to build things for the future, not saving to spend. And that is what is different from old times. Sombart, in a book called The Bourgeois, talks about what the ancient trader was like. Ancient traders had no systematic accounting. It was a pretty messy thing. When he earned money, he spent it, in trying to marry off their children well, or in buying a title of nobility, or to buy a villa and retire. It was not a systematic reinvestment. It was to earn money and then spend it, so that he would increase his status. But his status was not as a capitalist, but to try to prosper as a family, buy some title, or even buy some position. The capitalist is frugal, austere, thrifty. I think it was in the Foresight saga. He talks about living off the interest of the interest. In other words, never touch the principal. You have a sum, that sum gives you an interest, and that interest gives you an interest. You live on that interest.
Es una parte cultural entonces en el
Do you think there is a cultural part then in socialism that has taken root in Spanish-speaking countries?
En el sentido que usted ve las encuestas de valores a nivel mundial,
There must be something like that. If you look at the polls of global values, Spain, Argentina, Italy, their populations are among the most anti-capitalist in the world. In the world. From the OECD countries or the environment in which we move, the most anti-capitalist countries in the world. Not the government, the people. If there is a problem, we are always against the employer. We criticize the system, see it as an unnatural system. I don't know whether it's a socialist or pre-capitalist thing. The values of capitalism have not yet penetrated.
Una cuestión a lo mejor religiosa.
Perhaps a religious matter. Did this individualism grow more in Anglo-Saxon countries?
no es tanto individualismo, es una forma de pensar.
It's not so much individualism, it's a way of thinking. In fact, it is an old debate. I was talking about Sombart earlier. Sombart says that capitalism occurs in Catholicism more than in Protestantism, and the proof is today. We can compare Catholic and Protestant Ireland, for example, Catholic Germany and Protestant Germany. Catholics are much richer, and among the world's richest countries there are many Catholics, even within the European Union. I mean, there is no cultural obstacle. I don't know why. I just know we have always been dedicated to criticizing the system. Probably because it is not natural. It is not something that is easy to understand.
Una persona cuando toca la lotería o cuando
When a person wins the lottery, what do they do with the money? Spend it. They don't say, I'm going to put it in an investment fund for several years. There is a culture of earning, spending. There are studies of people who win the lottery in Europe. There are a couple of hundred every year. Or elite sportsmen who earn large amounts of money in youth. Artists who earn large amounts of money while they are young. How do they spend their money? This is their vision, a lot of spending. But then it is not something that lasts long. They don't say, I earned this money when I was young, I'm going to make it last a lifetime. They could, but then they don't do it. They enter into lavish spending, with some exceptions.
Podríamos decir entonces que esta abundancia que genera el capitalismo.
Does this abundance that capitalism generates incentivize people to not save money?
y bueno, eso es uno de los factores.
Yes, that's one of the factors. Then there are other cultural factors, like the culture of living in the moment. I do not criticize or make moral judgments. I also think that sometimes it is institutionally driven. This idea of enjoy the moment, be free is encouraged. There's only one life, so enjoy it. They don't think about the future, but the future will eventually arrive.
Lyndon Carter, por ejemplo, cuando habla de estas cosas,
Lyndon Calder, when he talks about these things, blames the central banks. He blames the money culture of the states. When the Federal Reserve and other central banks in other countries are created, states pursue a cheap monetary policy. They flood the banks with cheap credit. And that changes people's time perspective. For example, to buy a Ford, previously, a savings plan had to be made. You'd have to save every month for 4 years, for example, and at the end of those 4 years, that money, plus interest, gives you the Ford. It requires a calculation to buy it. But you have to wait 4 years. That changes. They used to say, I want a good, I have to sacrifice, I have to think about the future, I have to restrict consumption today to have the Ford tomorrow. Now, it is, buy now and pay later. That was the central bank policy.
Sí, porque a ver, que si no generas incentivo a tener ahorro y
If you don't create an incentive to have savings, and you have the ability to say, give me money, and the money is practically free,
dinero creado de la nada y dinero que los
money created out of thin air, and relatively cheap money, and money that central banks create in 1,000 ways, but none of them are good.
la idea es que la preferencia para la gente
The idea is that people's time preference is, I don't need to sacrifice anymore. If I want something, I buy it and that's it. I'll pay interest later. That takes discipline away from the people. Money, for example, I really like money in the cultural sense. Inflation, how it affects people. This book that I like so much by Ferguson, When Money Dies. Or novels or books that talk about inflationary times. Stefan Zweig in The World of Yesterday, explaining how it not only changes prices, but also how people's culture changes. When money starts to deteriorate, people start living for today. In other words, they stop saving, they stop thinking about the long term, they make very short-term decisions that affect a lot of things.
¿Usted cree que nos vamos a tener que acostumbrar a vivir con un cierto nivel de
Do
inflación?
you think we have to get used to living with a higher level of inflation?
No debería, supuestamente el euro era para evitar eso.
We shouldn't. The euro was supposed to prevent that, wasn't it? Supposedly a euro governed by austere Germans, but I see it's not quite coming together.
¿Cree que puede tambalearse un poco el sistema del euro?
Do you think the euro system might shake?
Puede si se empieza, digamos, a convertir en una moneda así de que se devalúa.
Maybe, if the currency is devalued, if people see it as an unserious currency. Let's see if it regains stability or not. But I don't think they're doing things particularly well at the moment.
Usted hablaba de que en España no se protege de verdad la propiedad privada.
You were talking about the fact that in Spain, private property is not really protected. Why do you think so?
Su propiedad realmente no es suya.
Because there is no private property in the strict Roman sense of the word. Your property is not really yours. It is subject, for example, to the so-called social function of property. That is in the Spanish Constitution. The use of your property can be altered at any time, or expropriated if there is a general interest, allegedly benefiting others, or if it benefits the social. I don't know what the social is. My understanding is rather that the government decides at any given moment when a property can be yours or not. You have a property, but tomorrow it can be reclassified for better or worse. You have ownership, but not the use. I mean, what you can and can't do with it is determined by the government. For example, inheritance. You leave an inheritance, it's a metaphor, but it's actually like this. The state takes it and pays you money, or it does not give it to you. Many of these aspects should be seen differently.
Y por ejemplo, ¿cree que con la uberización que está sufriendo la sociedad
And, for example, do you think that the Uberization of society can also endanger private property?
Es lo que se busca. Yo no lo sé si es deliberado o no.
That is what is being sought. I don't know whether it is deliberate or not, but I see that public authorities favor certain solutions. It seems as if it is encouraged. I do not mean to say that Uberization per se is neither bad nor good. It's just that with Uberization, nothing belongs to anyone. Everything is rented, except the one who rents. Renting leads to a lack of a culture of care, of protection, of thinking in the long term. For example, I have a car and I try to take care of it. I change the oil, I try to fix it, because it's my car and it has to last many years. Renting everything can lead to disengagement. Everything is more volatile, isn't it? It's the same with housing. Okay, you can live in a rented house all your life, and it is a solution as legitimate as any other. And it is often a financially better option than buying. But I'm from a place. I like my place. My grandparents live there. I like it there. I also feel a certain, perhaps emotional, connection with my home. And I like to take care of my home so that it can be for my son in the future or something like that. But I care about it and I have a connection. It's a culture of care. The other option seems like it's kind of volatile. You don't have roots anywhere. You can move from here to there, like something that is interchangeable from one place to another. And you have no roots in anything. Rootedness has to be mainly with people, with the family. But of course, the rootedness with things is also of interest. If you plant a tree, you see it grow. I mean, it's there for life and you like to look after it. And the rest of the things too. So it's like you're not from anywhere. I don't care if I'm here, I don't care if I go there. I rent here, there, and so on, and it's a very detached thing. States love that.
No, esto que comenta es muy cierto porque al final parece que se están alineando todos los incentivos con las políticas climáticas.
All incentives seem to be lining up with the climate policies and so on, so that people do not own property and that everything should be leased. Transportation limits in the cities, so that people have no incentive to own a car, for example.
La idea es esta, es decir, parece como son seres, los seres sin propiedad.
Housing as well. People without property were called proletarians. The proletarian is an uprooted being. He can move from one place to another without costs. He has nothing to lose. This has already been explained by authors such as Wilhelm Röpke, when he said, for example, that the great achievement of the proletarians was to have their own housing. I mean, their house and their things. That was Röpke's idea, to create entrenched people, people who had something to defend and who were interested in not having major changes or revolutions or things like that. The opposite seems to me to be an atomized thing. It is also more difficult to coordinate with neighbours you don't know at all. If neighbours change, it is difficult for you to create any kind of solidarity.
Totalmente. Le iba a preguntar algo que yo creo que es bastante impopular a día de hoy.
I'm going to ask you something that I believe is quite unpopular today. Why is the minimum wage no good?
A ver, si fuera bueno, ¿por qué no pone 40.000 euros al mes?
If it was good, why don't they set it at 40,000 euros a month? It's that simple. The minimum wage is rarely given serious consideration. It is also seen as something that benefits the worker. I think the minimum wage was invented in Australia or New Zealand to prevent immigration. Minimum wages are seen as something that defends the worker, but they are usually mechanisms to exclude the weaker sections of the population from the labour market, and it is also something that is rarely studied and benefits large companies over small ones. And this is also rarely said in our circles. A newcomer anywhere, a migrant, for example, has to jump a hurdle. He has to produce at least the minimum wage, which in Spain is 1,300 euros, or something like that. Each month he has to produce around 1,300 euros. Actually more, because you also have to add up the employer's share of social security contributions. An immigrant worker, just arrived, has to produce a value worth 1,500 euros if he wants to be hired. But of course, a newly arrived worker has many handicaps. He is as intelligent a person as we are, probably as hard-working or harder working than those here, but he lacks tools such as the language, which is a basic issue, because it excludes you from many wages. Ancient sociologists spoke of workers of symbols and workers of materials. That is to say, work involving the handling of materials and work involving symbols, writing and so on. If you are not fluent in the language, even though you are an intelligent and educated person, it's more complicated for you to find a job handling symbols, jobs that require writing, reading, knowing rules and so on. They get the toughest jobs because they also have the handicap of having to cover a minimum wage when they haven't yet mastered the necessary skills. A job is not just the job, it's the informal relationships you have, the information you have, knowing how to move, knowing the country's labour standards. The first few days it takes time to adapt. I'm not saying that an immigrant doesn't have the skills, he is just as good. I would even say he is a risk taker, a daring person, who is capable of risking his life to come here. So he has to have certain qualities. But he has some handicaps when he arrives, and these handicaps initially prevent him from earning the same as some people here. If you put a barrier on top of it, like the minimum wage, they never make it. So it is a tool to expel young workers from the market, and that is what it was designed for. Something similar happens to a young worker. A young worker does not meet this minimum level for the first few days, because he does not yet have the necessary skills to do the job, because he lacks experience and other things. So for the first few days he might even make a loss to the employer. So if you put a barrier, they don't want to hire the young worker either. Why is Spain's youth unemployment rate more than twice as high as that of the general population? Because the minimum wage harms the weaker sections of the population, immigrants and young people basically, and that is what it is for. And it also benefits large companies, because large companies are usually more capitalized than smaller ones, right? A large hotel chain, for example, has good capital means, has good tools, is better designed, has better logistics. This large hotel chain has to compete with a humble hostel. The hostel competes by working very cheaply, otherwise it does not compete. Because the hotel chain has better tools. A lot of competition is purely for cost, isn't it? By over-exploiting the worker and, perhaps, his employees. But it's the only way to be able to compete with a hotel chain that is highly capitalized, is very modern, has a lot of machinery and so on. So, if you introduce a minimum wage, you directly eliminate the competition of the hotel chain.
¿Usted cree que
Do you
flexibilizando
believe
el
that by
mercado
making the
laboral
labour
se podría-
markets more flexible, all young people with university degrees will find a job?
Pero a lo mejor no en lo suyo.
Yes, but maybe not in the field they want. Or in the field they want, but with a very low salary.
Me refiero que el propio mercado sea el que decida las notas de corte para
I
que...
think that the market itself should be the one deciding the cut-off marks.
Si se demandan determinados trabajos, ¿por qué no se pueden abrir más facultades de eso o ampliar los
Indeed, or how much supply there has to be for each degree. If certain jobs are in demand, why can't more of those faculties be opened? Or increase the numerus clausus of that faculty? Also, all the faculties don't operate with a price system, for example. All the teachers are paid the same, regardless of the demand our job has. All degrees cost the same. They are political prices, and that distorts a lot of things. So, not everyone is going to work in the field they want. That is very difficult. Everyone has the right to study whatever they want, but they have to assume the consequences of that. And then you also have to find your skills. They say, some jobs are not well paid, but I see philosophers on the internet who make a pretty good living, or I see people who explain things about art or ancient history. It depends on how you sell it to. And I think that this is an incentive for a lot of things.
Sí, yo también creo que Internet ha hecho que habilidades que a lo
Yes, I too believe that the internet has made skills that perhaps were not so highly prized in the market before can now be rewarded by the fact that they can now reach more people.
Estamos un poco como anquilosados, es decir, de mezclar unas carreras con otras.
Yes, more people can be reached, or new solutions can be sought. Sometimes we mix degrees. For example, they mix art history with business. These are interesting things because there are art markets. There are markets for a lot of things. Why can't we make use of the synergies? I don't know how to redesign the university system. What I'm saying is that it is difficult for everyone to get a job in the field they want.
¿Cree que la izquierda ha evolucionado
Do you
hacia
think the left has evolved towards a new paradigm in which the worker is not in the centre? Is the left more focused in a class struggle divided in small lobbies?
Es que el obrero ahora ya no es clase, ya no es el proletario de antes.
That is the intersectionality, as they call it now. The worker is no longer the proletarian he used to be. The factory worker is not privileged, but he is no longer the helpless being he used to be. The industrial worker has a fairly decent salary, or slightly above average. What we have now is a precariousness which is often found in university professions. The typical worker of a large factory is not usually among the most defenseless members of the population today, because he usually has a good contract, trade unions to defend him, and a relatively decent wage. The precariousness is in other areas.
¿Cree que el anarcocapitalismo
Do you think that anarcho-capitalism would be feasible anywhere as of today?
Pero el capitalismo no se puede prefigurar.
Anarcho-capitalism cannot be prefigured. So people think it would be like Spain but without a state. It wouldn't be like that. Anarcho-capitalism has to emerge in the same way as capitalism, in specific small places, somewhere with a small society where they try it, where they let it work, and then others would copy it. Capitalism started in very small places. It was not global. It started in specific places and affected relatively few people. But since it worked so well, it was imitated in other countries, and eventually the rest of the countries had no choice but to imitate them, otherwise they would be left behind. That is the idea. So it's about creating some kind of space. Humer, when he talks about these things, speaks of very civilized spaces. Very civilized. In the heart of Europe or places like that, which normally do not have hordes of barbarians. So, in one of those places that is peaceful, stable, where anarcho-capitalism is tried. Liechtenstein-type states, or like Andorra, where they try anarcho-capitalism and where they see that it can work. In a small country, anarchy is seen as closer, because it is clear that in the end, the president, the great duke or whatever, or the prince, is not that necessary. People have him close to them, and they also see that, normally, they can almost function without him. Somewhere where it worked well, and then it would spread.
Una cosa que me planteaba mucha gente que era más minarquista.
One thing asked by minarchist people, how do you privatize then security or justice?
Primero, la seguridad ya es privada, incluso en los países como el nuestro.
First, security is already private. Even in countries like ours, 90% or 80% of security is private. In what sense? It consists, for example, of doors, in fences, alarms, on living in certain neighborhoods, in avoiding certain situations. The police play a very important role, but it is more of a sanctioning function. If there is a crime, however effective the police may be, it still takes them a few minutes to arrive. You know you have to defend yourself at the moment of the crime, not the police. That's why we use those things I mentioned. We don't walk at certain times in certain neighborhoods. We take certain precautions, or we live in a quiet place. This is usually how security is ensured. The police deters or arrests the offender after the crime has been committed, not before. So much of security is already private. If by security you mean security between states, then we are saying that we have a state because there is another state. But then it's circular reasoning. If there is no state, almost all would be common crimes. Great agglomerations of armies would not be created, which are the ones that justify having another army, right? It would basically be a police function. We'd have to study, for example, all the police systems that existed. For example, the first police force in the United States were the Pinkerton, a private police force. They were the first to be set up in the United States. They were a private police in San Francisco for a long time in California's non-statehood era and later. It is necessary to see how police systems can be established. We all understand private police. We see them everywhere. The discussion is not about feasibility, it is about legitimacy. I mean, some would think that it is not legitimate to be arrested by a private police. But nobody thinks it is not possible. The debate is different, isn't it?
¿Y respecto a la justicia?
What about justice?
La justicia suya ya hubo ya un intento.
There have been attempts for a long time.
Ah, pero sería un poco salvaje, ¿no? En plan,
Yeah,
cada
but
uno-
it would be a bit wild, wouldn't it?
No, habría leyes y habría normas.
No, there would be laws and there would be rules. It's just that they would be different. I repeat that it cannot be foreshadowed. Here, in this case, what we can do is, first, see how it was done in societies who had no state justice. There is a book by Bruce Benson called The Enterprise of Law, Justice Without State. Second, see what legal solutions exist. There would still be jurists. People say many jobs would disappear. No, there would still be a need for police. They would be different. Some military would probably still be needed, or something like that. But they would be different, as they existed in the past. And the same goes for judges, lawyers, and so on. They would still exist, but they would be different than in the past. For example, in the Qadi justice system, a judge was chosen, but the judge first had to prove his reputation. Now, the current system is someone passes a competitive examination and is sent to a territory. If there was a crime here, we would have the head of the court on duty here in this territory. We could not choose the judge. In the old systems, the parties could choose the judge. There had to be a certain consensus of the parties. I mean, I think in what they called the Wild West, which wasn't so wild, crime rates were lower than those in New York. In the so-called Wild West, one party chose a judge, the other would choose another judge, and the third between the two. A reputation of being an honest judge was necessary. Can a judge be corrupt? Yes, he could be corrupt, and one of the parties could buy the judge. But then what would happen? That judge would get a bad reputation, and nobody would want to hire him again. He has to have previously earned a reputation as a judge. And the judge was normally someone with a reputation of a saint, with extensive legal expertise and so on, because otherwise nobody would hire him. Nobody is going to hire a corrupt judge. You can hire a corrupt judge, but who would hire the third judge? There wouldn't be a consensus. The other party wouldn't want to hire him. Once the judge has been accepted, the decision had to be complied with under penalty of exclusion. So, there are different ways of sanctioning. We almost always understand punishment as imprisonment or fines. There are many other, for example, shame, as it was used in old times, or the marking that today can be done, for example, with a bracelet. There are many ways in which a person can be sanctioned without using prisons or fines. There can be more modular options. Today, we focus on only two formulas, a fine or imprisonment, as if all crimes were exactly the same, right?
Y por ejemplo, el derecho de autodefensa que estamos viendo.
What do you think about the right to self-defense? Everybody is now talking about the case of this elderly man who shot a thief who entered his house.
A ver, yo no soy jurista, entonces no...
I'm not a jurist. I didn't read the sentence. I think he shot him more than once. So I don't want to talk about things I don't know. Although some cases catch our attention, legal systems already understand that there is a certain right to self-defense. The position of the attacker is not the same as that of the other. Auto-defense in the United States is not always self-defense against the offender. It is an act of defense against the state. In the sense that the Americans, when they wrote the Second Amendment, it wasn't to defend against the thief. It was written so that a policeman or a political police cannot come in at night and take you hostage. United States has many flaws and many failures, but they never had fascism as we had it in Europe. Never. That is precisely the purpose, to avoid the possibility of the state going to your home and arresting you at night without a trial, and taking you to a gulag or something like that. They wanted to have some capacity for defense. The United States has many shortcomings, and it is an imperialist state, but there was never fascism as we had here. This is precisely what they wanted to avoid.
Cambiando un poco tercio, Miguel, hemos visto que en Argentina...
We have seen that in Argentina, they have Javier Milei as president. Do you think it is often necessary to go into shock or a very deep economic crisis in order for things to really change?
Hombre, a veces sí. Porque tú ves que estás hundiéndote, que aquel país no levanta cabeza.
Sometimes yes, because they see they are sinking, that the country is not getting back on its feet for 40 years. But I also think that some of what Milei has to offer isn't something that hasn't already been tried. They see that the rhetoric of the Kirchners was philo-socialist, interventionist, regulatory, a democratic socialism, and it was a line of delving deeper into the same thing, and they see that it was worthless, that it didn't work, and so on. So they try something different. The problem is to try anarcho-capitalism in a society without anarcho-capitalists, also without anarcho-capitalists among its political class. Not even anarcho-capitalists. I see few classical liberals or minarchists there. They are people who have political skills, but I think that they still have not internalized what the idea is about, except for some of them. What I see from the outside, at least in La Libertad Avanza, is that I don't see much debate on this. And the anarcho-capitalists or liberals or libertarians or whatever you want to call them that exist in Argentina, I see them underrepresented in government. I do see that Milei believes in it.
Yo creo que Milei es precisamente todo lo contrario de lo
I
que...
believe that Milei is precisely the opposite of what a politician should be, because I see him as very pure to his ideas, and this is where politics can penalize
Sí,
you.
sí, sí que sí puede penalizar. Repito, pero a él sí que le veo que cree. Otra cosa es que le dejen hacer.
Yes, it can penalize, but I do see Milei believing in the idea. Let's see if they let him do it. President, no matter how capable he is, cannot control a government. Organizational theorists talk a lot about the scope of control. That is to say, how many subordinates can a boss manage? It is estimated that between 8 and 10 can be directly supervised. He cannot supervise the rest. That is why there is a government. That's why Milei doesn't do everything. The problem is, what about his ministers? First, many of them are not from his party. They are from the Conservative Traditional Party. I don't think they've internalized what the idea is about. And the problem is that even his own people did not internalize the idea. And I see some tensions. For example, the president is a libertarian and the vice president is a lady who is a classical conservative. And then you see that they pass the omnibus law, which is pretty decent, but then they control the price of mutual insurance companies. That is, laws that are antagonistic with what Milei is advocating. Probably because Milei let them work freely, and they did what they knew. Are the mutuals raising their prices? I'm going to punish them. So, part of the government has not yet internalized what it is all about. And I guess Milei can't be in fights every day with everyone. I believe more in bottom-up change. That's why I like Gramsci so much, and why I talk about him so much. Before making anarcho-capitalism or liberalism or libertarianism, you have to make people think like that. If people are like that, they will ask for it. Gramsci said, let's not make revolution, let's make socialists. If we make the population a socialist, people are going to ask for socialism. And that's what was achieved in countries like ours. People want more socialism, not less. So they give socialism to them. A large part of the political class comes from the population, so they have also internalized these values. One of the problems of our time is that we lack patience. Modern people call it cathedral thinking. Those who made the cathedrals knew they were not going to see them finished. A cathedral used to take 100 or 200 years or more to build, like the one in Santiago, which took several centuries to be completely finished. But they made it anyway. Each one did his part. We want Milei to arrive and tomorrow Argentina will be anarcho-capitalist. No. We need to sow, we need to educate. And Milei can do that very well. Pedagogy.
Yo creo que el problema precisamente es esa visión cortoplacista del
The
político.
problem is this short-term vision of the politician. I'm here for 4 years and I want results
La
now.
gente también los quiere ya.
Sí.
Gente quiere ya que en un mes se vea y no se va a ver en un mes.
And people want results now as well, but they won't see them in a month. It requires patience and sacrifice. It is not immediate, but we all want it now. No, that's not the way to do it. And the first thing to do is spreading ideas in free battle. I'm not in favour of teaching my ideas in state schools by force, but they should be defended and discussed through the means we have. Disseminate these ideas and submit them for discussion. I have no fear whatsoever of publicly discussing these ideas. It is not necessary to impose them by force. I believe that in the end they will prevail, because they are better argued or because they work better. So, pedagogy is needed, and Malay now has a very good opportunity to teach by example. And the problem is if there is no example.
Por hacer un pequeño resumen,
Can you explain what the iron law of oligarchy is?
Es decir, que al final cualquier organización está dirigida por los...
The iron law of oligarchy means that, in the end, any organization is run by those who are most committed, by those who know the organization best, those who are most dedicated to it, and in the end, they end up constituting an oligarchy, and they don't want to give up the position. Once they are entrenched in their position, they don't let go, and use the position to perpetuate themselves. They create what they call caste. They end up creating an elite in a party, in an organization, that self-perpetuates. Robert Michaels applies this idea to the socialist parties of his time, who were very pure people. They were workers who came from a union, but they started working in the Reich Parliament. They get in touch every day with the bourgeoisie, they start having good salaries, eating in fine places, and so on. By pure logic, they end up being more related to the bourgeoisie than to other workers, because they are now their colleagues. But they are not necessarily bad people. They are just there all day long in Parliament. And they make bourgeoisie friends and things like that. And then they want to continue like this. So Michael studied a phenomenon of his time. Trade unionists of German socialism, in the end up creating an elite. And this can also apply to the German Greens. I remember when you were very young. They were very green and pure in Parliament, and now they are bombing countries and doing things like that. From being a super pacifist to very bellicose, because they want to stay there. They now rule in important states and create an oligarchy. But it is not something that happens only on the left. This is something that is typical of any organization that has an idealistic start. The alternative is to rotate the positions. When positions are rotated, we're always in the hands of amateurs, and then the others take advantage of that. Besides, if you know you're going to get kicked out, you have no incentive to do a good job. Why should I do it right if I'm going to get kicked out anyway? You change the structure of interests. It would consist in operating on ideological incentive only, and that can work, but that incentive alone usually does not come. It is often not enough. I'm not saying there are no pure people who believe in their ideas. I can be very pure, but I want to be the one leading the revolution, not you. I don't trust you to lead it well. It has to be me. It is a kind of iron law. It's not like a law of physics, but it always tends to be like this. But not only on the left. I think it is inherent to politics itself. It is inherent in political logic. This is what Michaels explains. Michaels is very interesting, but people don't read those authors anymore. They look like new ideas, but they are classic books, like Mosca and the Elitists. Mosca, Pareto, they are quite interesting people to read if we want to understand politics. Now, politics is kind of being disguised a little bit, with all the mathematics they put into it, and so many things like that. The wisdom, the mischievousness old political scientists had is now lost. Now everything is more aseptic, more scientific. So that kind of behavior, which is difficult to formalize, is not incorporated into the analysis.
si mañana le dieran el poder de ser presidente del gobierno, ¿qué es lo primero que haría?
If tomorrow you were given the power to be president of the government, what is the first thing you would do?
Que cualquier otro. Es decir, sé que eso tienta y sé que a la gente le gusta.
I don't want any power. Besides, it repels me. I would certainly be worse than any other. I mean, I know it's tempting, and I know people like it, and I try to know the vices that I have, and I try to avoid them. Something similar happens to me with this. Power repels me, because I don't know what I would do with it. I suppose I would be like the others, because of the iron law. I don't think I'm different from anyone else. That's why I try to avoid such temptations. But if I had that power, I would try to respect private property. I would change property laws. I think I would start there. I would take all expropriation powers away from me. In general, I would respect private property. I think it would be good even for squatters, because they would be able to buy cheaper houses. They would have no need to squat. Laws that protect squatters disincentivize saving for property. In other words, disincentive to home ownership, or discourage building houses. And what the squatter wants is a house. If there were houses in abundance, the squatter doesn't want to squat. He will squat, I suppose, out of necessity. I don't know exactly the psychology of each of them, but I understand that if they had affordable housing, they wouldn't squat. As food is not normally stolen, although it can be stolen. People usually steal other things. Food tends to be more plentiful, and tends to be cheap or easy to obtain. If houses were cheap, easy to acquire and so on, there would be no incentive to squat. The squatter doesn't pay, but lives in a way that he could be kicked out at any moment, lives in a tense situation. I don't think he is comfortable like this. What I want is for them to have a choice of cheap housing. The way we can have quality, low-cost housing is to let people build and invest in housing.
Ya ves.
¿Autores que recomendaría para gente que quiere empezar?
Which authors would you recommend for people who want to get started in politics, economics, liberalism?
Para entenderla, me gusta, por ejemplo, tipo libros tipo las 48 leyes del poder.
Regarding politics, for example, to understand them, I like books like Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power. But in general, the Machiavellian book, because it explains the policy so well. I recommend The Guilt Game, too, by Christopher Hood, which is perhaps not so well known, but it's also a very Machiavellian one. Or the classics like this. Not just Machiavelli, Chinese classics, Han Fei Tzu, and so on. Not how politics should be, but how it actually is. In politics, we often think about how it should be. Much of the theory of the state and so on is what a republic should look like or how mixed powers should be, these things like that. I prefer to explain how it actually is. Regarding economy, for a start, economics in one lesson. Also human action, but that's more difficult. Human action is dense, but people from the Austrian school prefer big books, because they say that big books take more time, and you end up getting more and more fond and you remember better. A book you read in a day or a day and a half, after a few years you don't remember, but a book that you spent a lot of time with ends up becoming a part of your life. And Human Action is a very interesting book.
¿Autor preferido en torno al liberalismo?
Favorite author on liberalism?
Yo soy muy rothbardiano, o sea, me gusta mucho, sí.
I'm very Rothbardian. I like him a lot, especially his way of reasoning. Jesus Huerta de Soto, and I also like Hayek. I also gave some lectures on Marxist authors that have impressed me. There are things I like about them. For example, I like Charles Wright Mills very much. The Power Elite, a very Marxist book, but a book I like. I do not limit myself to one school. The most complete for an introduction to these topics for me is Rothbard, because he touches on many topics and is very interesting. But for the prose he has, for the ease with which he writes, I like him the most.
Pero también tiene una cosa que hace mucha crítica sobre ello, y es el tema de...
There is a lot of criticism about him when he talks about a free market for children.
Creo que se malinterpreta.
Sí.
Yo creo que se refiere, se refiere, por ejemplo, a una adopción.
I think he is misunderstood. I think he refers to, for example, an adoption that does not require the intervention of the state. For example, that American actress who negotiated with the parents in Africa and brought 10 or 6 children from there. It is an adoption that is negotiated directly with the father. And I suppose that is what Rothbard is referring to.
Que normalmente lo sacan de contexto diciendo que va a haber un...
They usually take it out of context by saying that there is going to be an Amazon for children.
Una subasta o una cosa por el estilo. Yo las hubo en la antigüedad con esclavos y cosas.
Yes, as if there was a market, an auction or the like. There were slave markets in ancient times, but it is not feasible today. The debate is, whose child is it? That is the debate. That is the philosophical debate. What happens is that, of course, it is taken out of context in my opinion. So, whose child is it? Is it the father's or the state's? Who has the right to give it up for adoption? The father or the state? I think the debate is about that. Rothbard has a thing. He goes to the extreme. It's like the Sadducean traps they set for Christ. I mean, they asked him questions that, whatever he replied, he would look bad. And Rothbard was sometimes asked, who would be in charge of the children? If he answered that the state should be in charge, he wouldn't be consistent with an anarcho-capitalist ideology. What they are trying to do is to catch him in situations in which he defends the state. Anarcho-capitalism, as I see it, is an intellectual exercise. How can we solve this or that problem in the absence of the state? And I think that's what Rothbard tries to do. Before creating an anarcho-capitalist society, we have to see whether it can be done or not. And I think we have to discuss whether it can be done or not. And the process of discovery is fascinating, because it forces you to find out how the existing state works and how it could work without the state. You have to look at how they did it in other societies, how it was done in past times, how it is done today, elsewhere, and so on.
Última pregunta, Miguel. El tema de las pensiones. ¿Cree que es sostenible el sistema actual de pensiones?
Last question. The topic of pensions. Do you think the Spanish pension system is sustainable?
No, a ver, sostenible es en el sentido de que bien se pueden retirar fondos de otras partidas y dárselo a todas las pensiones.
The current system is sustainable if the state is sustainable. Funds can be withdrawn from other budget items and given all to pensions. It is more difficult for pensions to be sustained at the same level as today. That is, if the same amount, measured as a percentage of the last salary, what is called a replacement wage, can be at the same percentage as it is now. Currently, they are the most generous in Europe, public, not private. Most European countries combined a public system with a private system, so pensions in other countries are higher thanks to the private part they have, not the public part. If the population gets older, there is a relatively smaller active population. The current 20 million young people, who are the active population, have to support more and more pensioners. They have to provide for their children, and public health is also a pay-as-you-go system. It's not just pensions. You have to maintain the health of that whole collective. The problem is, can it be done? Yes, but at the cost of substantially lowering the living standards of those who are working.
Que es exactamente lo que está ocurriendo, que está habiendo un traslado de riqueza de los estratos más jóvenes a los...
Which is exactly what is happening. That there is a transfer of wealth from the youngest to the oldest sectors.
Mucha gente piensa que la productividad viene sola. Llega así, hay más productividad por el mero paso del tiempo. Productividad tiene usted que invertir en ella. Quiero decir,
It's a problem of productivity. People think we will have more productivity by the mere passage of time. No, you have to invest in productivity. If we want more modern industries, we need to buy new machines, new robots, whatever it is. But we have to buy. You must have money to buy it. There are many countries in the world, Lesotho or any African country, living in the 21st century. Why don't they have the same productivity as us? Why don't robots, machines arrive there? Because they have nothing to buy them with. They cannot buy the same level of productivity that we have. Productivity doesn't come by itself, you have to buy it. The problem is that by using so much of the salary for pensions, there is no money left to increase productivity. Our society has less productivity increases than other countries, because a large part of the resources are spent in current consumption and are not spent in capital. The workers produce less. If I have a tractor, I produce more than if I don't have a tractor. But also if I don't have the latest generation tractor, I will produce less than someone who has the latest generation tractor. If I cannot acquire such tools, I can't be as productive as the others. In Spain, the worker does not work less, but his production is lower. And on top of that, he has to pay pensions to many people, and there is very little left for him. So, we are deteriorating our living standards. There are solutions, but no politician will dare to say them. Raise the retirement age, for example. They already did that. Delaying retirement age by 2 years is equivalent to reducing pensions by 10%, because the average number of years a pensioner receives his pension is 20 years. If you delay retirement by 2 years, it's like reducing the pension by 10%. But you don't notice it, because you get paid later. Another solution is like in Argentina. Raise pensions by less than inflation so that, over the long term, and on a compound interest basis, pensions are being reduced. But by indexing to the consumer price index, that element can be eliminated. I suppose they will try to charge higher taxes to the working people or pensioners themselves. When VAT is raised, they also raise it for pensioners. When they raise personal income tax, it is also being increased for pensioners. If they put VAT at 23% or 24% instead of 21%, in the end it's like having your pension reduced. But the deception effect that Keynes mentioned is still there. So it is sustainable in the sense that they will receive a pension. Now, how much they will get, I don't know. When they will be paid, I don't know. And how much the worker will have to pay, I don't know either. It's certainly a demographic phenomenon, and it's pure demographics. When the current pension systems are installed, the population base could be 6, 8, 10, or 12 to 1. That is, 12 workers for every pensioner. Because it was a population of very few old people who were paid for only 3 or 4 years because life expectancy was much lower. But now there are more and more of them that last longer, and there are fewer and fewer young people. I think pensions killed themselves. One of the reasons, not the only one, for having children was also to have support when you are older. Now, with the state, people are unconcerned. They think they are going to receive a pension whether they have children or not. So, what are we going to have them for? Or why would you have the same number of children as before? It is not the only factor, of course. But it is also an influencing factor.
Yo también creo que se ha encarecido el tener hijos. Antes tener hijos era bastante más barato, ahora tiene como más...
I also believe that it has become more expensive to have children. Now it has more costs.
Tiene que tener un montón de cosas. Tiene que tener una. No, pero cosas en sí en el coche. Tiene que.
Because they put a lot of regulations on it. You must have a lot of things. You must have a car seat. The school is theoretically free, but you have to buy textbooks. You must adjust their schedules, things like that. Also, it is not a modular school. In the past, variable schedules could be established in schools. I mean, afternoon classes, morning classes. Why does everything have to be on the same timetable? Why can't they adapt to the child's own pace? So you have to adjust, and that increases costs. And then, of course, a lot of extracurricular things. It's also our fault. We want the child to be competitive, learn Chinese, and things like that. So those things have costs.